And we're back. Hope y'all enjoyed your walk if you went on one, or maybe you're sitting right where you were just a minute ago. Either way, happy you're still with me. So right now we are in Cycles Render still, and I'm just going to quickly show you how I would set up a render like this. Again, if you're familiar with rendering, I'm not going to go into anything insanely in depth here, but just go through the basic stuff. I realize some people may be beginners and maybe you don't know how to render. So just really quickly, a couple things I would do. This adaptive sampling is a new feature in later versions of Blender. I turned that on. Once again, I haven't really done a ton of testing or anything, but it seems like it's a good thing. Basically, it will use less samples in certain areas when it doesn't think that it needs those samples. I think that's kind of how it works. And then as far as the rendering settings, if we render with 128 samples, that may not be enough for something like the glass. You can see right now in the viewport option, we're rendering up to 32 samples. So if I were to just change that to 128 and let that load, I can turn on this overlays here so I can watch that compute. You can see that it will just progressively get a little bit more clear. But 128 for a glass material probably wouldn't be enough. To really get a smooth glass, you might need to use like well over 2,000 samples or something like that. But that's going to start to take a ton of time. And if you're doing something like an animation, that would probably be an unreasonable amount. Again, it depends on, what your client is. If you're going to be creating a, billboard to go in Times Square or something like that, then yeah, go ahead and crank the samples up and give it the proper time to render. But for me, in most cases with something like a still, I'll crank this up as high as I feel comfortable with, and part of that depends on like if I'm about to go walk my dog, maybe I'll turn the samples up higher than if I'm going to sit here and watch the thing render. So, for me, maybe something like 900 or so would be reasonable, because what we're really going to be relying on here is the denoising features in Blender, which are quite powerful and really do a lot to clear up a render. So I would just, you can have this denoise in the viewport, which is something I haven't talked about. I tend to not like that. It just, sometimes I feel like I'm not getting the most accurate look at what the thing's actually going to be, but you're welcome to use that. I hadn't mentioned it until now, so I usually leave that off. But in the render, if you have a optics, it's an NVIDIA thing, enabled graphics card, then you can use the optics denoiser. Otherwise, I think one of these other two will work fine. So for me, since I have that card, the optics rendering works well. And then as far as these light paths and sampling, if you were maybe going to stack like a bunch of wine bottles, one in front of another, the biggest thing you would need to worry about here is the transparency bounces. So sometimes if you have many transparent objects kind of on top of each other, then you would need to turn that up. But I almost always use these defaults. But then again, if it is a higher quality render and you want it to look absolutely the best, then you can turn on, I usually just do full global illumination, which will crank these all the way up. Some of these probably don't need to be all the way up. But I'm not the type of person I just really don't invest a lot into optimizing my renders. I'm more interested in, if I want it to be high quality, I'll just turn it all the way up and let it take the time that it needs. And, if you're working at like Pixar or something, obviously some of those frames can take hours and they have entire departments of people focused on optimizing these things. But for me, I'm usually either just leaving it at the default, which is this limited global illumination, or maybe, I don't know, maybe that diffuse goes up, I forget, but I'm not messing too much with that type of thing. Now for the caustics, I would turn on reflective and refractive. I think I touched on that earlier. Again, not a total expert on what stuff like that does, but go ahead and turn them on. It sounds like a higher quality thing. Again, and this is just kind of the way you think about things like this. For me, I just don't like to dive too deep into things like that. There are videos that go into explicit depth on all these things, and I encourage you to learn more about that if you're interested. But if I'm being honest, this is how I set things up. It's just very simply going through here, checking out some of the options. The only other thing that I would mention that is a little bit of a time saver, and I have done some light experimenting with this, but there is an add-on, if I can remember where the thing goes. Oh, and you want to turn this denoising off. I'm not sure why that's on. There used to be an old denoiser, which for some reason that was on. That's interesting. But I would typically, I think you want to have that one off, which I'm not quite sure why this one is still an option. But that is there. But what am I looking for? I'm looking for, so when you render, you can control the size of the tiles. I think that's under performance. Yeah. So there's this add-on called Auto Tile Size, which again is a default add-on that comes with Blender. You can just turn that on. If I just search for tile size, Auto Tile Size will examine your render. I think it's mostly looking at the aspect ratio and the resolution, and then also whether you're rendering on a GPU or a CPU. Typically with a CPU, you want to use much smaller tiles, like 16 by 16 or 32 by 32 or something. Whereas with a graphics card, you want to use larger tiles. I think that tends to give you better performance. So I just use this auto tile size option. It seems to work fine. One time I actually tried to I was like, okay, I need to know what I'm talking about here. I need to spend more time looking at all the details and optimizing things. And I probably spent an hour, trying different tile sizes and seeing what happens. And there were certain times where I was getting, a few seconds faster, especially on a high sample render. But I totaled up all the time it took me to figure all that out, and then divide that by the savings or whatever. I did the math, and I would have it just didn't make sense for me to save a couple seconds on my applications. But again, I don't want to downplay the importance of optimizing your renders, but don't worry too much about it. I mean, we're really focused on getting a final image here. Now, I did touch on the color management earlier. I like to use this high contrast. You don't have to use that. If you want to, you can also use curves. You can just automatically have your render have some curves applied. And then I usually leave that off though. But the other thing is, there's the entire Blender compositor, which I am not particularly familiar with. I would like to learn some more about that myself. I've started to use it, but I don't really feel comfortable speaking much on it. But there is the whole Blender compositor where you can do all sorts of post-processing effects at render time. But that's about it. The hotkey to render is F12. And once you do that, it will pop up a new window, and you can control in the user preferences what happens here. If you want it to pop up as a new window, or you want to pop up in a particular viewport. So you can see we've got 900 samples here. It's a little bit cloudy right there, but you'll see once all those tiles finish out. And by the way, if it's going slow, when it's in an area that's less detailed, it will render faster. So if we zoom in here, we'll see once the denoising goes through, it's going to clear it up quite a bit, I think. Is it denoising? Maybe the box that I unchecked was the denoising. maybe those are combined now. Denoising. Okay, so it does not appear to have been denoised, because we would not be seeing that. So let's maybe try that one more time. I'm doing a little learning myself here. Now, where was that setting? Okay, so denoising. Let's try that one more time. Let's render this. I'm going to drop the samples just to 600 so it goes a little bit faster. But the denoisers are super powerful. I even saw a tip, I think it was a CG Geek was posting about how you can render at a very low sample count and turn on denoising and just double your resolution. So render this in 4K, for example, and then size it down, and you can get some really good results that way. Okay, so I think this might be denoising as we speak. Okay, I believe that has been denoised, because for only 600 samples, I don't think we would be seeing what we have here. So anyways, the denoising features, they're really helpful. They allow you to use much less samples. Let's move this all the way down to 128 and see what we get. So 128 obviously renders very fast. And okay, so yeah, it's denoising as it goes. And for still images, this is really spectacular. And honestly, glass materials would be the worst ones to denoise. If you don't have any glass materials, if you're working on a different project, the denoising works spectacular for reflective subsurface type materials. But for glass, you can have some issues. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit in the animation section, but sometimes there can be some flickering with the way the denoise works. But in general, use as high of a sample count as you can. I think for the best render, you really would want to probably turn off denoising and just use an insanely high amount of samples. I mean, like 6,000 or something like that. I would almost never for anything, even a still, go over like 2,000 samples, if I'm being honest. But it's up to you. It's up to the kind of the look you're going for and how much time and attention you can give to one render. But yeah, so the denoising options are there. They help a lot. Don't want to spend any more time talking about that. Feel free to leave comments. I think Teachable is going to allow a comment section, but that's all I'll spend talking about that. And now what I want to do is move quickly into a little discussion about Eevee.